What's up, carp freaks? All this week I am going to be sharing with you some top tips for what is my favourite method at this time of year, out and out boilie fishing. Now, from my experience, waters that tend to really lend themselves to a boilie only approach are venues that have large stocks of nuisance species. Now, there could be like the larger nuisance species such as tench and bream, or it could be where there's large shoals of small species such as roach and rudd. Now, in these situations, if you're going to be baiting with pellet, particle, boilie, crumb, or naturals such as maggots, then obviously you're going to attract these smaller species into the swim. And I do think it's a common misconception that a lot of people have, that if you are to create this feeding activity from other species, then the carp will come in and bully them out the way. But I have not found that to be the case in a lot of situations. You imagine there may be several £100 in weight of small fish feeding there, and you may only be attracting half a dozen or a small group of carp into the swim. I think they're more likely to go elsewhere where there's an easier meal, rather than where there's loads of small fish attacking the baits and what have you. And that's certainly been what I've found from my past experience. Now, there are situations when I do think that an out-and-out boilie approach perhaps isn't the right way forward, and this would be on venues that has large stocks of carp or where the carp is swum around in large groups. Now, if you were to use pellet and particle in this scenario, then all those small food items means you're able to keep the fish feeding for longer in the swim before they either get full or lose interest. So before you do decide on your baiting strategy, you really do need to give careful consideration to the stock of fish in the lake, whether there are lots of nuisance species there, and also the actual stock of carp in the lake itself. So now I'd like to talk about the boilies themselves. I'm currently using the CC More live system. It's a great all year round bait, but I think it really does come into its own during those colder months, and it's caught me so many carp over the past few years. Now, on this occasion, I've got with me some 18mm boilies. The main reason for me using 18mm is because of the distance that I'm fishing. I'm fishing just over 100 yards, and this means this larger size means I can get the bait out there with a throwing stick quite comfortably, whereas I might struggle with a smaller bait, a 14mm for example. Also, there are a few smaller nuisance species in here, and the 18mm is a lot more impervious to their attentions as opposed to a smaller bait as well. Now, I never use my baits straight from the bag. As they are, they will catch you plenty of carp, but I think there's lots you can do to really maximize the attraction, boost the food signals, and also improve your chances of catching. Now, what I like to do, I like to soak my baits in either the matching lake water at the venue that I'm fishing, or bottled water for at least 24 hours before my session. I do like my baits to be softer. I do think that it's easy for the carp to eat, especially when they're not perhaps feeding with a great deal of conviction. So I do like my baits to be softer. So I have soaked these baits prior to the session, but they are soft, but not soft enough that I'm not able to get them out with a throwing stick without them splitting. Now, a lot of people think this is washing the bait out, washing the flavours out and all the attractors out. I'm not actually trying to do that. I just want them to be softer, lighter in colour, but I do also want to maximise the food signals, crank up those attraction levels. So what I do, into the water I add some Amino Blend 365. It's a lovely creamy smelling liquid that really does complement the live system well. So I add that to the water. So while it's soaking in all that water, it's also drawing in more flavours and food signals and cranking up those attraction levels. So it's not actually washing out the flavour, it's actually putting more flavour in whilst also having a softer bait. So now I'd like to talk about baiting up and the tools that I use, and my favourite tool would be the throwing stick. This is the R20, which is a carbon stick. It's lighter than plastic, which allows me to get extra distance, and I'm quite comfortable at baiting up in excess of 100 yards. It's also much more friendly on the arm due to the reduced weight. It also has a loading port right next to the handle, which allows me to load up more quickly, and that enables me to get into a rhythm much better and bait up more accurately and more efficiently. So the throwing stick is great because it allows me to create a spread of bait, meaning that the fish have to move between mouthfuls, they're grazing around over the baited area, keeping them in the swim for longer. But I also like to have a concentration of bait to tighten up the baiting strategy a little bit more, to give the fish something to really home in on, and for that I use an impact spod. So a combination of a throwing stick and the impact spod allows me to create what I think is the perfect baiting strategy. Got a nice concentration of bait, a scattering of bait around it to keep the fish moving and grazing in the swim. And if I was to do this in a smaller venue, then I would use a catapult, but the baiting strategy would remain the same. Now I'm going to show you the rigs that I use for my boilie fishing, and as you will see, they are very, very simple indeed, but it's a rig that served me well for more years than I care to talk about, really. So I've got a few tied here on one of these rig boards, and they're constructed from 25-pound Camotex soft, going down to a short curve hook. Now I use a size 4 for 14mm, 15mm baits, and a size 2 for 18mm baits. You can see there I've got a rig ring tied to the hair slightly below the barb, and this rig itself is actually not quite complete. Now I do like to use a long piece of shrink tube over the eye. The reason being, I think a long shank hook turns better, catches hold better than a short shank hook, but what a long shank hook lacks is strength. So I am using a short shank hook for the strength and artificially extending the shank with a piece of shrink tube. Now the reason these rigs aren't quite finished and the shrink tube isn't already in place is because when they are pinned on the rig board, that long length of shrink tube tends to bend slightly outwards, and obviously I want a slight bend inwards with the shrink tube to ensure that the hook is pulling into the mouth, and also helps the hook to turn better as well. So yeah, that's why I don't do the shrink tube until I'm ready to use the rig. It's just a case of grabbing a rig off the board, put a piece of shrink tube on, steam it over the kettle, then we're good to go. Now I'd like to talk to you about my choice of hook baits, and when it comes to boilie fishing, I do like to match the hatch, especially at this time of year. That being said, I do prefer to use the matching food bait wafters rather than the boilies straight from the bag. Here I have a rig baited with one of the matching wafters, but these have been soaking in a pot of Amino Blend 365 for quite a few months now. And obviously, as they are taking on that liquid, they won't be as buoyant as they were straight from the pot without any additional liquids or flavours. But they do still sink slower than a standard boilie. And also, they are much tougher too, so they're more resilient to the attentions of small fish, which means I can happily leave these in situ for long periods, knowing that they're still going to be intact. Now, something I always like to incorporate wherever possible is a small mesh stringer. Just the addition of a 3-bait mesh stringer, just simply hooked onto the rig, provides great attraction and something for the carp to really home in on. In fact, the only time I wouldn't use a 3-bait stringer like this is if I'm fishing at any sort of range and the stringer would restrict the distance that I'm able to cast. So there we have it. There's my 5 top tips for fishing with boilies. It's a great tactic as we go into the autumn, and if used in the right situations, I'm sure it will help you put more fish on the bank.